The two men entered into David's hotel room and shared a night of passion. Bolaji, as he stood outside, whispered to himself, "Maybe Pastor is having a deliverance service in the room." Reverend David was a man of stature, known for his impactful sermons and respected as the pastor of one of the largest congregations in the community. He was affectionately called the voice of God by his followers. He was such a revered man of God. His wife, Pastor Mrs. Chidera, was not only charming, but also the epitome of grace. They had two beautiful children, Samuel and Precious. They were admired by many people at church as just the perfect couple to learn from. Reverend David was the husband every woman in their community wished for, and Chidera was often approached for tips on how to make their husbands emulate his dedication. Reverend David was a very popular preacher who was known throughout the entire community and was often invited for church programs to minister. One day, he was invited to a conference in a nearby town and took along his assistant, Bolaji, a bright and eager young man of 25 years old. At the hotel, Bolaji and Reverend Ayo had to share the same room as the rooms in the hotel were all occupied. In the evening, as Bolaji was in the bathhouse taking his bath, Reverend David Ayo found himself peeping at Bolaji, an urge he fought to suppress. The urge was so strong that he could no longer suppress it, so he wandered into the city's nightlife disguised so no one would be able to identify him, in search for a distraction. The city was filled with lights, with loud music. Reverend David Ayo walked into a club to have some drinks to ease the strange urge he felt. As he sat there, he was approached by a tall, dark, handsome man. The man offered to buy him drinks, which David accepted. As they conversed, the man's hands brushed against David's thigh. Initially, David was shocked. However, he felt a strange sensation go through his waist, which made him uncomfortable. The urge was so strong that he consented to the man's actions. The two men entered into David's hotel room and shared a night of passion that would remain a secret. Meanwhile, Bolaji, oblivious to the truth, assumed the strange noises were just fervent prayers echoing through the walls, and that maybe Pastor David or Reverend David was having a deliverance service with another member. When David returned from the conference, he resumed his normal duties with a newfound passion. This new passion caught the attention of his wife, Chidera. She asked, "Is everything all right, David?" she asked, noting his brightness. "Of course, my love. Just feeling blessed," he replied with a forced smile. However, a shift occurred in their intimate life. David, who had discovered a new thrill in his secret encounters, no longer craved Chidera's touch. Initially, dismissed as fatigue from his busy schedule, Chidera felt a growing distance, an inexplicable change in their once vibrant marriage. Chidera, perceptive and observant, began to sense that something was wrong. Over the following months, she noted David's increasing detachment, his mind often wandering far from their conversations. His frequent absences stirred unease in her heart. One fateful Sunday, during a service filled with the Spirit, a familiar face entered the church, a man who made David freeze in place. He quickly regained his composure, but Chidera, ever watchful, noticed the change in her husband. After the service, David approached Maxwell, pulling him aside for a quiet chat. "Why are you here?" David demanded, urgency in his voice. "I missed you, David. Thought I would come to see how you were doing," Maxwell replied casually. Chidera, entering the scene, greeted Maxwell warmly, oblivious to the intention. "Are you an old friend of David's?" she inquired. "Yes, a very good friend," Maxwell replied with a charming smile that made David's heart race with panic. Maxwell continued, I am a very good friend of David," he muttered. "I just came to town and I don't have any place to stay, so I decided to check up on him and see if he can get me a place to stay." Chidera invited Maxwell to stay with them until he found his own place. David's heart sank when he heard that. He wanted to protest, but found his voice lost in fear. With a smile masking his true feelings, he reluctantly accepted the decision, dreading the unfolding days. As the evening wore on, Maxwell settled into their guest room. Later that night, David, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, slipped into Maxwell's room, desperation etched across his face. "Please, don't ruin my marriage or my ministry," David pleaded. But Maxwell's intent was clear. With a smirk, he moved closer, trying to kiss David, who instinctively turned away. "Just one kiss, David. I promise I won't stay long. Just a moment to relive the good times." Initially, David tried to stop Maxwell from anything happening between them. However, the urge was so strong that he could not resist anymore. He gave in. Days turned into weeks, and David's tension grew unbearable. Chidera confronted him. "David, what is wrong? You have been so distant," she pressed, her eyes searching his for answers. "Nothing is wrong, I swear," he replied, a lie that tasted bitter on his tongue. Chidera knew all was not well with her husband, but she sighed and kept silent. Reverend David had a dark secret that haunted him. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world around him fell silent, thoughts would creep in, desires he had long suppressed. Dear viewer, why do you think Reverend David had such a strong and unbearable urge that seemed uncontrollable? And what dark secret haunted him from the past? Let's continue this story to find out. Bolaji had always admired Reverend David. He saw him as a beacon of wisdom and strength, a man who seemed to have everything figured out. The teachings, the authority, the respect. It all felt like something to aspire to. But after that conference, something in Reverend David's demeanor seemed to shift. Bolaji couldn't place it, but the man he looked up to no longer carried the same light in his eyes. Meanwhile, David wrestled with the overwhelming shame of his secret, the weight of Maxwell's presence in his home, the piercing gaze of his wife, Chidera, and the subtle suspicion growing in the eyes of the church members began to suffocate him. He tried to hide behind the sermons, praying for forgiveness, but each word from the pulpit felt hollow, as if his voice no longer belonged to him. Chidera, though devastated, was not a woman who would sit in silence. Her faith demanded answers, and her loyalty to their children compelled her to protect them from the storm brewing beneath their roof. She spent hours in prayer, pleading with God to reveal the truth, even though deep inside she already knew what her heart had feared for so long. One evening, as David sat in his office at the church, Chidera knocked softly at the door. She entered, her face a mask of determination. "David," she began, her voice steady but laced with sadness. "We need to talk. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. You have changed, and I know something is wrong. If you won't tell me, I'll find out myself." David's heart raced. He wanted to confess, to finally unburden himself of the lies. But the fear of losing everything, the church, his reputation, his family, choked him into silence. I have been under a lot of pressure, Chidera. The church, the travel, the expectations, is all too much," he stammered, avoiding her piercing gaze. Chidera shook her head. "This is more than stress, David. I know you. You have been distant for months, and I am tired of waiting for you to come clean." Before David could respond, a loud knock echoed from the church's main door. Bolaji entered, looking pale and anxious. "Reverend David, there is something you need to see outside. It is urgent." The air in the room thickened. David nodded and hurried after Bolaji, grateful for the distraction, but dreading what awaited him. Chidera watched them leave, her heart pounding, knowing that whatever was happening outside would only deepen the mystery. As they stepped outside, a crowd had gathered at the gates of the church. Whispers and gasps spread through the people as David approached. At the center of the commotion stood Maxwell, bold and unapologetic, flanked by two men who looked like they were enjoying the spectacle. "Reverend David," Maxwell called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was just telling these fine folks here about our strange arrangement." His voice was laced with a taunting edge. Bolaji looked to David, confused and worried. The crowd murmured, eyes darting between the pastor and the stranger. "Maxwell," David said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" Maxwell smirked. "Oh, don't act surprised. I am just here to let everyone know who the real Reverend David is. The man behind the sermons, the man behind the holy robes." David felt his knees weaken. He glanced back at the church, where Chidera now stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What do you want?" David hissed through gritted teeth. "Want? Oh, nothing much. I just thought it was time for the truth to come out. Maxwell replied, stepping closer. You can't hide forever, David. Bolaji stepped forward, sensing the tension. Reverend, maybe we should get him out of here. This isn't the place for... No, Maxwell interrupted, raising his voice. This is exactly the place. The church should know the truth about their beloved pastor. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. David looked around at the faces he had once inspired, now staring at him with suspicion and disbelief. The walls were closing in and there was no escape. Chidera stepped forward. Her eyes looked on her husband. Is it true, David? She asked, her voice trembling. Is he telling the truth? David's silence was louder than any confession he could have made. Chidera's breath hitched, and she took a step back as if the distance between them could shield her from the pain. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some stepping closer, others moving back, as if they feared being tainted by the scandal. Please, everyone, David finally spoke, his voice cracking. Let's go inside. This is not a time or place for such accusations. Let us pray together for strength, for guidance. But his words were met with silence. The reverence he once commanded was gone, replaced by skepticism and unease. Maxwell laughed, a cold, harsh sound that cut through the air. Pray? That's what you are going to do, David. Pray it all away. When you were giving it to me, did you pray? He laughed. Bolaji, ever the loyal assistant, placed a hand on David's shoulder. Let's go back inside, Reverend. We will figure this out. But David knew there was no going back. The truth, no matter how he tried to spin it, had been laid bare. And now, all that remained was the fallout. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, David stood frozen, his mind racing. He had lived in the shadows of his desires for so long, but now, in the light of exposure, he was stripped of everything he had built. Inside the church, Chidera sat alone in a pew, staring blankly ahead. The weight of her husband's betrayal pressed down on her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know if prayer could heal the wounds David had inflicted. Bolaji stayed by David's side, but even his loyalty wavered. The man he had looked up to, the man he believed in, was not the man he thought he knew. As the night closed in, David retreated to his office. The walls of the church that had once been his sanctuary, now feeling like a prison. The echoes of his deception followed him, and he knew that the battle for redemption, if it ever came, would be long and arduous. David had some explanations to give to his beloved wife. How will he go about it? He kept wondering. When David returned to the house that night, he met his wife sitting on the bed, looking worried. He knelt down before her and said, I know you are very angry at me, and I probably deserve to be treated this way. But before you take any decision, please hear me out. There is something I have kept away from you for a very long time. Chidera turned and whispered, "Go on, I am listening." David sighed heavily. "When I was a child, I was constantly abused by my own father. He would come to my room every night to have intimacy with me. Anytime I told my mother about it, she would beat me and ask me to keep quiet. After a while, I noticed I was drawn to men, and I had such a strong urge that I could not control." Chidera's eyes wide open as she was surprised. David continued, "Maxwell is telling the truth. We are partners, and we have been seeing each other for a while now." Chidera's jaw dropped. She couldn't believe her ears. Her own husband, a gay? David said, "Forgive me, my love. I am sorry." The truth is finally out. The dark secret that haunted David is out. Will David receive forgiveness from his wife? What will become of his ministry? And how will the church receive this news if it gets out to them?
Don't forget to like and subscribe.